We want to have a look at how perfect our earth is to support human life. And the second thing that we want to look at is some designs in nature that indicate that there must be a creation. So that's our aim for tonight. Now, as you may have just seen there, I put it to you that there are a number of things that humans absolutely need to be able to be on earth here, for us to be able to live on earth. And these are 4 of these things. So we have to be the right distance from the sun. It affects the temperature. We want to have a look at how perfect our earth is to support human life. And the second thing that we want to look at is some designs in nature that indicate that there must be a creation. So that's our aim for tonight. Now, as you may have just seen there, I put it to you that there are a number of things that humans absolutely need to be able to be on earth here, for us to be able to live on earth. And these are 4 of these things. So we have to be the right distance from the sun. We'll look at that later, but that obviously affects the temperature of the earth amongst other things. The earth needs to be on a tilt. The earth needs to spin, and the earth needs to have the right amount of oxygen and atmosphere. So what we want to do first is just have a look at these 4 things to see how unique our earth is. And it just so happens to be that our planet fulfills all of these things, and we can have a look, even just by observing the solar system, that we can see that our planet is very unique. It's blue, it's green, and it's a perfect place for humanity to live. And if we just, before we look at these 4, let's just consider Mars. So Mars, obviously the planet that is one more step away from the sun than Earth is. So first of all, it has a gravity that is just 38% the strength of Earth's. Now, this is not like a major issue in reality. A lower gravity just means that you feel lighter, you develop muscle less, and there can be like bone problems, but it's not like a massive issue. But the other things though, so the other thing is that it has a low atmospheric pressure. Now, this is a major issue on Mars. So I just want to tell you about something called the Armstrong limit. So Mars, it has an atmospheric pressure lower than what's called the Armstrong limit. Now, just to understand the Armstrong limit, we need to understand that the boiling point of water is actually dependent not just on heat, but on atmospheric pressure. So, as I'm sure you all know, on Earth here, water boils at what? What degree does water boil at? 100, yes. But did you know that if you were actually on the top of Mount Everest, where the water pressure is less, the atmospheric pressure is less, water actually only boils at 68 degrees. That's obviously less than 100. So you can imagine that, that might be amazing at the top of Everest. You get up there and you're like, I want a cup of coffee. Awesome, it's not going to take as long to boil. But, that can be a problem if you go into even higher altitudes. If the pressure continues to drop, then the boiling point of water continues to drop, and the Armstrong limit is when the boiling point of water is actually only 37 degrees. 37 degrees is the internal body temperature of humans, and that is obviously a problem because then we would start to boil ourselves. And they say that a human not in a pressure suit on Mars will last no more than 90 seconds. And now, this is obviously also assuming that they can hold their breath for 90 seconds, because the other problem about Mars is that there's only 0.4% oxygen on Mars. That's obviously not enough oxygen for us to breathe. In addition to this, the atmosphere is so thin that the UV rays come straight through, and that has health effects. And possibly one of the other major issues is that it has a toxic soil as well. So none of these things, when you look at that, compare it to Earth, you see that Mars is definitely not a perfect planet for mankind. If we then consider Earth, so firstly, consider our distance from the Sun. So depending on where Earth is in its orbit, it actually does vary in distance, but it is anywhere between 146 and 152 million kilometres from the Sun. And how perfectly balanced do you think that is? So Dr. Alistair Gunn, who's an astronomer, at the Jordal Bank Centre of Astrophysics at the University of Manchester, he says that it's difficult to be precise about the size of the Sun's habitable zone. So the habitable zone is the distance away from the Sun where you can live. So he says, it's difficult to be precise about the size of the Sun's habitable zone because it depends on many complicated factors. But the latest research actually suggests that the inner edge of the solar system's habitable zone is between 0.95 and 0.99 astronomical units. And that means that the Earth would be uninhabitable if its average distance from the Sun was reduced by little as 1.5 million kilometres, which is only about 4 times the distance between the Moon and the Earth. So if the Earth was just 1.5 million kilometres on average, that is, so as I said, it does vary as it orbits the Earth, but if the average orbit was 1.5 million kilometres closer to the Sun, then the Earth would become uninhabitable. So what does this mean? What would happen if the average orbit of the Earth was reduced? Well, it becomes uninhabitable because it creates a number of circular feedback loops. So just to give you an example of some, if there's an increased heat, then the ice melts at the glaciers and the poles, and that means that there's less ice to reflect the sunlight back to space, which means that the Earth absorbs more heat, which then again increases the temperature and melts the ice, and so on and so forth. As well as that, if there's increased heat, then things like the permafrost melt, and that increases the level of methane, which is under the permafrost, and that means that there's a greater greenhouse effect, which again increases the temperature, and again you get these circular loops. And all of this would lead to the surface temperature of the Earth being so hot that it cannot support life. And again, if you consider it in the other direction, if the Earth were to move 10% away from the Sun, then the oceans would start to freeze and bring an end to the water cycle, which again would mean that life cannot be supported on Earth. So Earth's placement is perfect. So perfect, it surely makes a rational person wonder, did this happen by chance, or was Earth put in this orbit by design? A second thing that we want to consider is the Earth's tilt. So firstly, just for us to all know, the Earth tilts at about 23 degrees. And why is it important? Well, the tilt of the Earth is what produces the seasons. So you can imagine, as you kind of got on the screen, when the Earth is tilting towards the Sun like this, the northern hemisphere gets the sunlight more directly, and therefore it's summer in the northern hemisphere. And then when you spin it around the other way, when the Earth is on the other side of the Sun, it's tilting towards the Sun at that tilt, and the southern hemisphere gets more direct sunlight. And that obviously means that it's in summer in the southern hemisphere. And, maybe as a side note, for those that are interested, the tilt of the Earth is also why there are places in Alaska that receive 24 hours of sunlight a day for 82 days of the year. You can imagine living in one of those places would really do things to your head. You'd want to have really dark blinds, wouldn't you? So why is the seasons important? Well, primarily it's to provide a livable climate across the whole of the globe. It creates a climate where food can be grown in most areas. So Don Atwood, an ecological anthropologist at McGill University in Montreal, he says that if the Earth was not tilted, humans would have probably never advanced past a state of living in small, scattered settlements scourging for survival and often dying in horrific insect-borne diseases. So, just as another side note, as we said, so the tilt, it means that heat gets to the bottom and to the top of the globe. Whereas if it was just direct like this, heat would be focused on those middle areas. And that would be a problem because that would mean that the northern and southern poles of the Earth and the latitudes, the greater latitudes, both positive and negative, would become in like a permanent winter state. And that would mean that humans will probably not really live there because it can't grow food there and can't sustain life there. And so that would create this issue where they would all move towards the middle part of the Earth. And as we said, this has a number of issues if it was on a no tilt at all. So growing crops will become problematic because you don't have all of that area where you can grow crops. And a lot of crops that I didn't know this when I was looking this up and learning about this, a lot of crops that we use, like wheat, they actually only grow in the cool areas of the Earth. So if you've got really cold winters where it's just all frozen and then a real tropical zone in the middle, you don't have that moderate cool area. Winter is also what protects humanity from a lot of diseases like Ebola, which only survive in the humid areas. And if all of humanity was to be forced to live in that tropical zone, then there would be more problems with these kind of diseases. I guess on the other side, what if there was a greater tilt to the Earth? Well, if there's a greater tilt, then the seasons and their accompanying weather, like heat waves and tornadoes, would become severe and intense, and winter would be colder and summer would be hotter. More of the planet would receive 24-hour sunlight, like those places in Alaska, and that would obviously create other issues. So the Earth's tilt is perfect where it is because it provides that moderate climate and warmth to the whole Earth so that man can survive on the whole Earth. The next one to just consider is Earth's spin. So another aspect, the spinning of the Earth. Again, I didn't actually know this, so this actually makes sense when you do think about it. Earth spins at the equator at 1,668 kilometres, but as you move towards the poles, it actually spins at a slower speed. If you're standing there, you're kind of spinning at a slower speed. As you can imagine, someone who's standing in the middle of the room just spinning in circles doesn't have to spin as fast as someone running around the edge at the same rate. So the question is, what would happen if the Earth span faster? Well, say if the Earth simply span 10% faster, what would the effects be? So the first effect, not really a massive one, is that you'd simply have a shorter day, wouldn't you? So they say a 10% increase would be basically putting our clocks back 2 hours every day. You'd have a 22-hour day. But there are some more serious side effects of a faster spinning Earth. These relate to I can never say this word, Coriolis effect and increased centrifugal force. And we're going to just explore both of these briefly now. So, the first one, the Coriolis effect. So this is quite a serious effect if we were to spin it faster. So if it spins faster, then that increases the strength of hurricanes, increases the wind speeds due to the Coriolis effect. So to understand this, just consider. So if the Earth wasn't spinning, then winds would just go in a straight position, north to south, south to north, in a straight position. But because the Earth is spinning, it actually curves those winds. And just to sort of understand this, you can do this with some friends if you would like. If you were to sit on a merry-go-round and in this position. So if you sit in a merry-go-round and if it's not spinning and you just throw a ball from the bottom person to the top person, it just goes in a straight line. That's pretty easy and straight to understand. But imagine what would happen if the merry-go-round is spinning and you throw the ball. So you throw it and it spins. Now, I'm just going to play that one more time. You throw it, and when you kind of look at that, the ball went straight from the bottom to the top, but it kind of looked like it went on a curve. And that is the Coriolis effect. That is making, when the earth spins, it pushes the winds and spins the winds. And as it goes to, you can logically understand, if it's spinning faster, it's pushing those winds faster, creating more serious weather events. The other serious effect would be the increase of centrifugal force. So if we again visit our friends on the merry-go-round to understand this, so they're spinning around on the merry-go-round. And as they're spinning around, there are two forces at play. First of all, they've got the centrifugal force, which is that force of the merry-go-round trying to biff you off and throw you off. But to counter this, the friends, I'm just going to stop that spinning, the friends are holding on to the merry-go-round, and that is like gravity. But you can imagine, obviously, if the merry-go-round started to spin faster, that centrifugal force is acting more on the friends and pushing them off harder. The friends can obviously hold on tighter. But gravity, we can't just crank up gravity, can we? We can't just increase gravity to make us stay on the planet more solidly. And so a minor effect of this is the fact that we will simply feel lighter, which might be great for some of us. The more serious effect, though, is that the oceans will be pushed towards that equator where it's spinning. And as a result of that, there will be places that go underwater. So let me give you an example. So there's a person named Whitwood Frazak who works as an analyst for Esri, which is a company that makes geographic information systems, which, they do all the maps and the mapping and lots of stuff like that. So from GIS, from Esri, the company, he says that if the Earth was spinning 10% more, then the Amazon basin, Northern Australia, and the islands of the tropics will all go underwater. And if it was spinning at 10 times the speed, then the only places within the tropical zones, the Capricorn and Cancer tropics, that you could live at will be the tops of the highest mountains like Kilimanjaro and the tops of the summits of the Andes Mountains. So that would obviously have a massive effect on the Earth, making all of that area uninhabitable. The last one to look at is Earth's atmosphere. So we've already discussed the importance of atmospheric pressure when we briefly talked about Mars. But the thing that's amazing about Earth's atmosphere is that we have a perfect amount of oxygen. So there's this window, and a lot of labs and possibly mines, but definitely labs that have experiments. They have oxygen. I've forgotten what it's called. The things that count how much oxygen there is in the lab, and it beeps if it goes below or above particular points. So if it goes below 19.5, it starts beeping, because if there's only 19.5% oxygen in that lab, then humans will start to suffocate and faint. If it goes above 23%, then a spark could set off an explosion. Now, oxygen itself is not obviously explosive, but oxygen is a fuel for fire. And if there's more oxygen, then a spark, when it lights whatever it's lighting, it will basically essentially explode when it combusts. And the Earth has this perfect amount of 21% oxygen in its atmosphere. And for me, that is just amazing. All of these things, the perfect distance from the sun, the perfect tilt that we're on, the perfect rate that the Earth spins at, and the perfect amount of oxygen, again, we have to ask ourselves the question, did this just happen by chance? Did the Earth just end up like this by chance, or was it designed in this particular way? When we look at design in nature, which we want to do for the last half of tonight, there's really two things that we can look at. And, design in terms of, jobs and careers, you have like graphic design, making things look beautiful, and engineering design, making things work perfectly. And what we want to do is have a look at both of these to discover examples of design in nature. In terms of engineering design, I want to tell you about something called irreducible complexity, and I'm just going to provide one example of it. The term was coined by Michael J. Behe, who was an American biochemist from the University in Pennsylvania, Lehigh University. And irreducible complexity is the term used to describe something that is made up of multiple parts and relies on all of those multiple parts so that it can function. Or another way of explaining it is that it is something which is functioning that can't be reduced down to anything else and still function. Just to get our heads around how this works, just think of camping. Arguably, camping is something that is not irreducibly complex. So just to give you an opposite example first. So you could go camping, and you could go camping in a fancy caravan and take chairs and take fairy lights and everything like that. And you could call that camping. You could go camping and maybe take a camper trailer, and that's still camping. Or you could go camping and take a rooftop tent and a fridge with electricity and solar panels, and that could still be camping. Or we could reduce it down and maybe we just take a swag, and that could still be camping. Or maybe we just take a sleeping bag and go sleep in the bush. I don't know if that's pushing it too far, but this is an example of where you can reduce it down and keep still calling it camping, and it is still camping. On the other hand, though, we've got something like a mouse trap. Now, this mouse trap that's designed in these ways, they have a number of parts. They have a spring hammer, a catch, a holding bar, and a base. And if you were to remove any of those parts, it's not really a mouse trap because it can't trap mice, can it? It just simply won't work. If you take away the base, then there's nothing for it to hang on to. If you take away the spring, then there's nothing giving it that energy to trap the mouse. And therefore, it is not a mouse trap if you take away one of those things. Well, what is the point of this concept? Well, if there's something in nature which is irreducibly complex, then it cannot have evolved bit by bit. Just like the mouse trap, it needs all of its parts to function as a whole. And Darwin himself wrote in his book, Origin, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And at that point, Darwin couldn't find any, but we want to have a look at two tonight. The first thing that we want to look at is called the bacterial flagellum. So what is a flagellum? Well, essentially in Latin, it's the word whip. You can kind of see it looks like a bit like a whip. And what it essentially is outdoor motor. So it's the first outdoor motor ever discovered in nature. Man didn't create an outdoor motor till the 1870s, only 150 years ago, but there's been one in nature this whole time. And this is not just an ordinary outdoor motor. So this outdoor motor can rev at 6,000 to 17,000 revolutions per minute. If we just compare that to a car tends to rev at between 2,000 to 3,000 with an upper limit of, 5, 6, 7, 8, or even up to 10,000 revolutions per minute. So this can rev and rotate at 17,000 revolutions per minute. So this is a powerful outdoor motor. If we consider it in a little bit more detail, at the back of the bacteria is the flagellum, and it's a propeller. So this long thing is essentially like a propeller, and that is then connected to a drive shaft, which is again connected to the motor, which then gains its power from sodium ions which flow from inside and outside the cells. And just like an outdoor motor must be stationary while the propeller turns, there are proteins that act as a stator structure to keep the flagellum in place, and others act as bushings to permit the drive shaft to go through and rotate. And studies have shown that you need between 30 and 40 protons for this to be functioning. In addition to this, there needs to be a functioning control system telling the motor how fast to spin and in what direction to spin. And also, just say, for example, if we presume that these different components were in the cell already, maybe doing other functions, then for it still to be working, there needs to be something to tell those different parts how to assemble itself together into an outdoor motor. So it needs all of these things to happen at the same time for it to work. So if we think about this even more, how could a phalangem evolve in small steps if it needs all of its parts to function as a mechanism? Why would a drive shaft evolve if it has nothing to drive? Why would a propeller evolve if it has nothing to spin it? It simply just doesn't work. And again, if we think about this more, if we presume that there is some sort of mutation creating a drive shaft, why would natural selection choose to preserve that trait if it doesn't have any use in its current state? It just wouldn't. If the phalangem didn't have every single one of its components, it would have no use. And consequently, if it were to have evolved, it would have to evolve all its components at the same time, which is not what evolutionary theory tells us can happen. Another one which I find really interesting is this beetle. This beetle is called a bombardier beetle. And this innocuous looking beetle is about 1 to 1.5 centimetres long, and it's able to fight off spiders, frogs, ants, birds that come too close to it. And it does this by blasting the attacker with a powerful jet of hot, toxic fluid. And furthermore, the beetle can aim its weapons in any direction, even over its head, with pinpoint accuracy, and it can shoot up to 20 centimetres with its spray. I was going to show you a video of it, but I couldn't find one which was only like 30 seconds. They were all like 5 minutes long. But jump on YouTube and have a look at these beetles. They are just amazing. The bombardier beetle, it's most common in Africa, Asia, and the warmer parts of America. So the question is, how does it work? How does this beetle work? Well, essentially, it has two reservoirs, and it has a combustion chamber along with a valve used to aim the spray. And the first reservoir, it holds this component called hydroquinone, and the second one has a component called hydrogen peroxide. And these two are then injected into a combustion chamber, which has two enzymes. So the first enzyme, it frees up the oxygen from the hydrogen peroxide, which creates the energy that it needs to explode, like you've got, oxygen in, I was going to say in fizzy drinks, but that might be carbon dioxide, actually. So not in fizzy drinks. So the second enzyme turns the hydroquinone into benzoquinone, which essentially is a substance that smells bad, tastes bad, and stains your skin. And that is, what makes the bug not really very tasty. So, if it actually gets bitten by a frog, I don't know if they have teeth, if it gets sucked into a frog's mouth and it sprays it, the frog is like, ugh, that tastes gross, and spits it back out. And then obviously at other things like ants, they're more worried about the heat of the substance that gets exploded out. So it explodes out this valve at the back. And this explosion, it isn't just one big bang. What it is, it's a whole lot of small explosions, and it explodes 500 times per second to prevent it basically exploding its rear end off. And that's an amazing thing in itself. So, what makes this beetle irreducibly complex? Well, if we think about it together, well, simply put, if the beetle does not have all of the components, it will essentially just explode. And to quote a scientist in one of the videos that I was watching, he said, "Disembodied beetles simply can't evolve." And that is so true. If we think about it more, just so we understand this though, so imagine a beetle does happen to come up with these two chambers just the chambers themselves with the substance inside, why would evolution preserve that trait? Because at this point, these chambers have no function. Let's assume that maybe by random mutation, there is a third chamber that evolves, which has these enzymes, the combustion chamber, and then that bug thinks, I wonder what would happen if I push these compounds into this chamber with these enzymes. Well, boom, the bug explodes. And as we said, disembodied beetles simply can't evolve. If we maybe think, okay, so that bug, say he does miraculously survive and he says to his children, okay, you all need to create a valve, a turret at the end of your body to release this substance at some enemy. Let's just presume that happens. And they just create a chamber where it shoots it. They create a turret and the explosion happens. If they don't know that they need to go and create that explosion 500 times per second, well, worst case scenario, the explosion shoots the bug in the opposite direction and it becomes a bit singed, or worst case scenario, that bug explodes, and again, exploded bugs just simply do not evolve. And that is an example of irreducible complexity, because this bug needs all of its components. It needs the chambers, it needs to know that it needs to push it into the enzymes, and it needs to understand that it has to explode it 500 times per second at the enemy, otherwise it's going to explode. And it needs all of those components and that knowledge to be able to have that defense mechanism. If it didn't evolve, or if it didn't evolve all at the same time, then it would have exploded. And again, I put it to you that it didn't evolve at all and that it was created. Just the last 10 minutes, 15 minutes of tonight, I want to have a look at the other aspect of design, which is, like graphics design, making things look amazing and pleasing to the eye. So in the field of graphics design, if you jump on Google and were to type in what are the principles of graphics design, depending what page you look at, you'll get 5 to 10 principles. And they all have these same 5 principles that we have on the screen on there. They say that something that is well designed is something that is balanced, that has rhythm, pattern, emphasis, and contrast. And I put it to you that maybe a rational thinker could surely argue that if you see these principles in nature around us, surely doesn't that indicate that nature is well designed as well? So let's just have a quick look at some of these. So balance. One example of balance in nature is the food chain. At the bottom you have what is called the producers, and these are the things that live and produce their own food, i.e. plants. They photosynthesize to create their own food. You then have the primary consumers, and these are these are animals like other insects and small animals like rabbits, and these eat the primary producers. You then have the prey, which includes animals that are like rats and birds and foxes, and they are both prey to those smaller insects and smaller animals, and they are predators to those smaller animals, and they are obviously prey to the bigger animals, the apex predators, the last ones on the screen there, like lions, tigers, sharks, and other large fish. So the food chain, it really is both delicate and balanced. It's almost, like delicately balanced, I guess you could say. Each level, first of all, has to be sufficiently large to support the level above it, while not being too large to destroy the level below it. The lower down the food chain you go, the larger the level must be to support the energy needs of all of those above it. So obviously, if you're sitting in your home and you look outside, you'll probably see lots of plants. It's very easy to see the things that are on the bottom of the food chain. Less frequently, you might see a bunny. Less frequently than that, you might see a fox. And if you're lucky or unlucky, you'll come across a bear one day. And it's easy to see that when the food chain was created, it was made perfect. And when we consider, what happens if there was a disturbance in the balance, then things are quite disturbing. Like if you consider there is a problem, this is quite widespread at the moment. There's lots of talk about the loss of bees, for example, in Australia. But I just want to give you an example of the loss of butterflies in the UK. So the UK, the butterfly species fell by 58% on farmland in England between 2000 and 2009, by 58%. And you know what's causing this reduction? Well, an ecologist whose name I can't pronounce, Shanzo Bayo, maybe, from the University of Sydney, he says that there are two reasons. The first one is the elimination of trees, so the destruction of habitat. And the second one is that the fields that are replacing that habitat are being treated with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. But what's the important thing? What happens if there's a drop in the number of butterflies? Well, the smallest effect is that there's a hinder in production of food. So not just with butterflies, I should say, with the bees as well in that example. So there's a loss of food production. However, the greatest effect, if you were to reduce the number of butterflies or bees, is that there is a reduction in the things that eat them. So the birds and the lizards, their food source dries up, and then they slowly reduce in number as well. And if they reduce the number, then what happens to the food chain above them? What happens to the foxes and the bears? Well, they start to reduce in numbers as well. So the Earth's food chain is a delicate, balanced, and designed system. Next one is rhythm. So rhythm in design, it's maybe something a little bit more conceptual and imaginative than balance. But the BBC Bite Size, which is like a educational branch of the BBC, they say that rhythm is a relationship between elements that create a sense of harmony. And it goes on to say that rhythm can be seen in patterns and relationships between colours and shapes, and in repetitions of lines and forms. Rhythm helps to guide the viewer's eye around a piece rather than allowing it to settle on a particular focal point. And it outlines three types of rhythm. So you've got regular rhythm, which is elements that are repeated exactly in an evenly spaced arrangement, like sand dunes. You've got flowing rhythm. Movement is suggested through repeated organic shapes or through irregular repetition of repeating elements, like waves rolling in from the ocean. They are both regular and irregular repetition. You've got progressive rhythm, a sequence which is a sequence created in which the elements are changed slightly every time they are repeated. Like a fern, you've got the leaf, and the leaf is exactly the same each time, except for the fact that it gets slightly smaller each time. So again, I put it to you that the principle of rhythm is in nature around us as well. What about the principle of pattern? Well, patterns are clearly seen in nature, aren't they? We don't really need to go through many examples, but icicles are a great example. Another one is emphasis. Emphasis is clearly a principle in the design of a flower. A flower's beauty is designed to be emphasised so that it can attract the pollinators that it needs to survive. Contrast. Contrast is interesting because it's not really something that you see in the animal world much, is it? Most animals tend to blend in to their surroundings for either protection or for stealth. However, there is an amazing contrast when we look at the natural landscapes around us. At a local level, we have the contrast between the seasons, especially in Adelaide, I find, between, summer and winter when you simply look at grass, if you don't water it, of course. Looking abroad, though, we see the amazing contrast when we look at something like the Nile Delta. You see the amazing green where the water is against the sand of the desert around it. And in a similar fashion, we have these amazing trees, baobab trees, which this picture is a picture of a baobab tree coming out of what is called Kabou Island. And Kabou Island is a dry granite rock located in the middle of the Makikadaki salt pan, if I've said that right. And it's amazing because there's this great salt pan around it, and there's these small granite islands which have these massive trees on them, and it is such a contrast to its surroundings. If we had more time up our sleeve, we could have a look at the other elements of design. As I said, when you Google it, there are 10 normally, but these 5 is all we have time for at the moment. And I put it to you again that a rational person, when they look at a painting and they see these kinds of principles in the painting, when they see these characteristics in a painting, they're like, that painting is clearly well designed. That painting was definitely created. Or if they look at a statue or a monument and they see these elements in there, they're like, that's quite well designed. That's quite beautiful looking and pleasing to the eyes. That must have been created by someone. So I put it to you that surely a rational thinker can look at the earth and see these elements in the earth, these principles of design in the earth, and they can say, surely that is something that has been designed, not something that has randomly appeared or evolved. So to conclude tonight, I just want to finish on 2 points. The first point is that I put it to you that the theory of evolution and the belief in a creation is like 2 people walking into a plane scrapyard the day that a massive tornado has gone through it. Before the tornado, there are bits of Boeing 747s, A380s lying around, bits of wings, engines, electrical wires hanging out, and so on. And so during the night, this massive storm comes through, throwing these metal pieces in the air and creating a mess. And the following morning, or the following afternoon, Jack and Jill, they stroll into the scrapyard. And in front of them, they see this sparkling A380. And it's fully equipped with in-flight entertainment, fully painted in Qantas colours, fully fueled, fully loaded with water and food, and cleaned inside. It just looks amazing. And so Jill is like, wow, that is one cool design plane that must have flown in here this morning. But Jack is like, nah, mate, I didn't hear the plane come in. That wasn't brought here this morning. That must have been blown together in this pretty big storm we had last night. That scenario is the contrast between evolution and creation. The likelihood that this perfectly evolved Earth just appeared after a Big Bang is the same likelihood that that Airbus A380 was blown together by a storm. That likelihood is 0. For me, this is evidenced again by the fact that James talked about last night, that for scientists, not scientists, but for people who believe in evolution, they had to create an infinite number of universes so they could statistically say that, yes, this is possible. And to me, that is just blind faith. The other point that I just wanted to finish on is that tonight and last week's aim was to present the argument of why we believe the world was created and why we do not believe evolution theory to be true. And I want to make it clear to everyone that it wasn't to give the impression that we hate science and scientists. And I hope that we haven't given that impression to anybody. Because, Christadelphians, we do not hate science. And in fact, we love science. We embrace science, and science that is done through the scientific method of making observations, creating hypotheses, testing that hypothesis, and drawing conclusions. Evolution is not science. Infinite galaxies cannot be observed, and a Big Bang cannot be tested. The theory of evolution, despite it being accepted by many scientists, cannot be tested. It is simply a hypothesis, and that's why it's called a theory. One reason that Christadelphians love science is because it provides us with a way that we can observe God's creation around us in detail. With modern day microscopes, we have been able to see the amazing engineering in our nature, like the outdoor motors that we looked at today, like the chemical weapons in the bombardier beetle. And one thing that we haven't had time to look at tonight is the amazing complexity of the cell. And I just want to share a quote with you by Michael Denton, who has a PhD in biochemist from King's College in London and was a senior lecturer at the university in Dunedin in New Zealand. He wrote a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And he says, although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to the 12, so 10 with 12 zeros on the other end of it, the left-hand side with the decimal point, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery, made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. The cell, it wasn't understood or observed when Darwin made his theory. It is an amazing, complex part of life. And as, science discovers more complexities of life, it's only rational to suggest that the more complex life is, the more likely it is to have been designed. And I put it to you that it's not just more likely to have been designed, but instead that is exactly what happened. As we said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God said in verse 11 of Genesis 1, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed," and it was so. In verse 14, God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night," and it was so. Verse 24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures," and it was so. That is how the earth was made. It was not evolved, but instead it was simply made by God. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.